destruction of this heritage is taking place in the name of a particular interpretation of Islam, but that interpretation of Islam fits hand in hand with capitalism. So, far from being the alternative that it presents itself to be, it is really, Islamic economics it functions as an ideology for capitalism. So this is just an example, I think, of how we need to be critically creative to subvert ideas that are presented as alternatives, but which are actually, masquerading as such. And the destruction of heritage in Saudi Arabia is, it has gone very far. And it is amazing to me that the entire Muslim world has been very quiet about it. People who have gone for Hajj, more than once, have really lamented at how the ambience of the place has changed so much that you can feel very little of how it used to be 100 years ago, much less 1,500 years ago. Now, the last example, the fourth way in which the fourth way in which social sciences can be, or knowledge can be non-Eurocentric, has to do with its being politically relevant. Politically relevant. What I'm suggesting is that knowledge creation, knowledge production should not only be conceptually rooted in diverse traditions, relevant in that sense, it should not only be epistemologically pluralistic, it should not only be relevant in terms of subverting commonly held ideas, but it should also be relevant to the main issues outside of academia, and it should contribute to an understanding of the main issues, and it should have some impact on those issues. I want to give one example, which is very relevant and current in Malaysia. In the last few years in Malaysia, there has been a concerted campaign to demonize and vilify Shiism. This has been something that was in which the political elite, some members of the political elite, including some high-level ministers and members of the religious elite, the various religious departments of the various states, have engaged in using the government-supported media to spread a combination of half-truths and distortions and misunderstandings about Shiism. For example, the idea, they're too ridiculous to mention, but they should be mentioned so that you understand what is going on. The idea that Shiites don't need to perform Hajj pilgrimage to Karbala is sufficient, that Shiites have their own Quran, that Shiism is a religion created by a Jew by the name of Abdullah bin Sabah, and that Shiites have various practices that suggest that they are either deviant or even out of the fold of Islam. This has been widespread in the last couple of years, especially in the Malay language newspapers, but also to some extent in the English language newspapers, with very sectarian and even fascist language used. For example, one religious department official suggested that there's no place, had been suggested several times, that there's no place for Shiism in Malaysia, and that Shiism should be eradicated from Malaysia. These are the actual words that have been used in the English media. The Malay media used the term menghapuskan Shia. Very, very dangerous language for those of you who understand Malay. Now, what is the role of social scientists? What is the role of social scientists and historians and other scholars when it comes to this? Not only to correct misunderstandings, but also to engage in a kind of discourse that shows that the differences between Sunnis and Shiites are far less than what is presented by presented in the media, presented by the religious authorities. For example, it happens in this country that when the month of Ashura comes, when the month of Muharram comes, when Ashura comes, when it comes to commemorating the death of the murder of Syed Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, any mention of Syed Hussein is seen seen as would be seen as a Shiite ploy. In other words, if you talk about Syed Hussein, you would be branded as Shiite. Sunnis have been cut off from the historical tradition because they don't realize that there's a strong Sunni tradition of commemoration of Karbala, not in the way that the Shiites do it, but there is nevertheless a strong tradition of commemoration of Karbala, and that Sunnis historically were as much against the murder of Hussein as anyone else. This is just one example of the need to recover history in order to show that the gap between these two communities in Islam is not as great as what it is made out to be. And in fact, if one were to look at Sunni sources about Syed Hussein, you will find that there's very little disagreement between Sunnis and Shiites about the event of Karbala. But it is not possible, at least in this country, in public, to talk about this anymore because of the demonization of Shiism that had been going on. So much so that newspapers refuse to print such articles. It would be difficult to get a public venue for a public lecture on this topic because people's minds have been closed to a great extent due to the onslaught of the media in the last few years. Now, there are a lot of issues that are going on in many Muslim countries, including Malaysia, where people tend to be about which people tend to be silent and are not engaging in the subversive and critical discourse in order to correct misconceptions and to bring people together. This example of anti-Shiism is simply just one example. Now, I want to conclude with a couple of points. I think mainly 2 points. The West has brought with it 2 problems for us. The intellectual problem of Eurocentrism and at the same time, through the process of modernization, the more practical problem of kind of nihilism founded on the values of the marketplace. Calculability, predictability, standardization, and so on. The values of the marketplace, which have spilled over from the marketplace into other areas of life. Family life, education. Education is a very good example. Education is so much affected by the marketplace values, such that we are talking about ranking, about global ranking, and we are stressing on quantity. We're stressing on publishing in highly ranked journals, and we're losing sight of the overall goal of education. Certainly, that is happening in Malaysia. And you also have, with the development of nihilism founded on market value, the values of the marketplace, you also have religiously inspired nihilism, right? Such as we see in the case of ISIS, even in the case of the Saudi economy, in which you have a destruction of heritage, the destruction of values indeed. You have the commercialization of religion in this country, in Malaysia, in the month of Ramadan. That is the time where you eat the most, because you have all kinds of Ramadan buffets. That's where people get put on weight and get indigestion, and there's a lot of wastage of food because people pay 80 and 90 ringgit for Ramadan buffet, but they're not, and they pile their plates with food, but they're not able to eat much because it's a fasting month, and their appetite is not as their appetite at night is not as great as it is during the normal months. So there's a lot of food being thrown away in these hotels. Just a very simple example. So what I want to suggest is we should not imagine that Eurocentrism in academia is our only problem. Just as we study Eurocentrism as a problem in our universities, we should also study how we have willingly, through government policies, adopted a nihilistic lifestyle in society. So it seems to me that this is an important agenda for research. That's my first point in my conclusion. My second point in conclusion is this. Eurocentrism, even as far as academia is concerned, Eurocentrism is not our only problem. We have created other problems in our universities, in our educational system, that have nothing to do with Eurocentrism. Just as we study Eurocentrism in order to decolonize our universities, we should also study plagiarism, academic dishonesty, corruption in the universities, and so on, in order to clean up our universities. Now, these problems have nothing at all to do with Eurocentrism. In some universities in the world, certainly in Malaysia, there is a great deal of academic dishonesty that is taking place. I will only give you one example. There is a practice in the humanities and social sciences of professors co-authoring works with their students, supervisors co-authoring works with their students. Now, it is unethical for a professor to co-author with a student if the professor doesn't do any of the writing or doesn't do any of the work. This is the case in the humanities and social sciences. In the sciences, in engineering, in computing, and in other fields, it's common practice because the supervisor and his students are actually involved in the project together. So one can consider the supervisor as not only an author, but maybe the most important of authors. But it doesn't work the same way in the human sciences, in the social sciences. The supervisor is merely the supervisor. If the supervisor wishes to be co-author with his student, then he or she should be involved in the writing. It's even more unethical when supervisors expect their students to be co-authors when they haven't even done any of the work, and it's not even the work that is connected with the thesis of the student. The student may be doing other works, other articles, unrelated to his or her thesis, but is also expected to put the name of the supervisor. This is an extremely unethical practice, and this has nothing at all to do with Eurocentrism. And there are many other unethical practices that are happening in our universities and other universities. In many universities around the world, it's even worse. You can buy your thesis. You can buy an ISI article, right? I think some of you know what I'm talking about. In one country I've been to, there are advertisements all around the university advertising the sale of ISI articles. If you need an ISI article in English, pay a company a certain amount of money, and they will write an ISI quality article for you. They will write a PhD thesis for you, and this practice is widespread. It is known by professors, and theses like this are accepted in university and passed. Students and professors are publishing ISI articles which they never wrote, but which they paid for. This happens in many countries. All these kinds of problems have nothing to do with Eurocentrism. So it is hypocrisy for us to critique Eurocentrism. It's a valid critique, but it's hypocrisy for us to critique Eurocentrism without at the same time looking at the problems that we ourselves have created in our own universities. So let's be more balanced about the problems of our education. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. We have Suzanne gave me this beautiful gift of sweets, and I would like to pass them around to share with you while we have the question time. And perhaps if you could return the tin to me sometime before I leave at lunchtime. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're now going to move into question and answer following those two very different, but I think very interestingly connected papers. So if Anwar, you can rejoin us. I know that, does Uncle Idris have a comment that he wants to make?
Farid, because his father is a pioneer in this field. In fact, bringing to public knowledge that we are not inferior. See, lazy and so on, and what you call this captive mind. So presently, what he has said is very true, extremely true. I've been telling all the time that Islamic banking is a fraud. And also the other practices are not true. And also a lot of things happening and we are not acceptable, see. So that's what my secretary suggests that I must voice out this here openly. So that I'm very willing, agreement with him, I want to work with him together with the Lord to further these ideas into the academia or government or politics, whatever.
Can I add something to? I would just like to get from Farid, if possible, since he has been traveling quite considerably besides just Iran. What is the extent of critical rethinking that is going on in all the places that he has visited? I mean, is there any remarkable work going on? Because I mean, obviously in Iran, there is a lot of thinking, there is a lot of organized thinking, there are bodies, there are imams, there are people in Qom who are, as a group, they are able to formulate new paradigms for their research work within the Islamic framework and so on. But what is your experience about countries besides Malaysia and Tehran? Have you, please tell us what is happening there in terms of the decolonizing agenda?
Thank you for your question. It's a big topic, of course. I'm not sure how to approach it. Well, I think one way to view the question is to say that throughout the world there have been a variety of responses to Eurocentrism, and that itself is very interesting. You've had, the indigenization movement, both in terms of indigenous, in terms of localizing knowledge, but also indigenous in terms of the sources of knowledge in terms of indigenous peoples. Right? So the term indigenization has been used in both senses. You've had movements to nationalize the social sciences, you've had movements to decolonize, and then you had the whole academic dependency movement that received its inspiration from the Latin American school of economic development. So the critique of Eurocentrism and Orientalism itself is various, ranging from very universalistic, pluralistic critiques of Eurocentrism to more nativistic critiques. So that, I think, has not properly been studied and documented in a comparative manner. For example, how do we compare the attempts of the Chinese to sinicize sociology and anthropology with similar attempts in Africa, and the attempt to Africanize philosophy, for example. So we lack that kind of approach. Now, in terms of alternatives to Eurocentrism, again, we see there's a great deal of uneven development. In our region, I think the most advanced country is the Philippines. The Philippines have Jose Rizal as a starting point, often seen as one of the first critiques of Orientalism, even before the term was used. Rizal lived at the end of the 19th century. He criticized the European way of studying Filipino society and proposed an alternative approach to the study of Filipino history and society. Of course, you know very well, India is a very leading country in this respect. But there are a few problems. One is the lack of, contact that we have with each other. I think you spoke about birds that have no wings. If I can sort of modify your analogy, the problem is these birds have wings and they fly too far away, leapfrogging, if I make sense of what's leapfrogging their own region, right? So from Singapore, for example, or from Kuala Lumpur, we're more interested to fly to Oxford or Cambridge or to Harvard, rather than to fly to Delhi or to fly to Tehran or to fly to Istanbul. So that's, I think, part of the problem.
I'm going to allow Kevin to say a word about this as well, but one thing that's also struck me here around indigenous knowledges and decolonisation. Decolonisation necessarily refers back to the period of colonisation, to the Eurocentrism. What I was interested by in Kevin's presentation, and also in things that Betson has been saying, is that there isn't that same reference point of the colony and the colonial era. There is something that is, pure would not be a good word for me to use, but there's an authenticity to the original indigenous knowledge that's not always referring back to the decolonial. But what I'd ask Kevin to say was, again, are there examples of indigenous practices that have come into his experience of the university and education?
Yes, in Australia there's been a practice of having indigenous studies in most universities, but this follows the path of anthropology and studying these cultures as separate, on which you apply Western models of understanding. One of our members, Christine Black, is an indigenous law theorist, and she's an example of where these indigenous concepts are going beyond their own culture to understanding their disciplines. And in legal theory, of course, when we look at ownership of land, that's often about the competing human interests involved in who has possession. But for many Aboriginal peoples in Australia, the land has its own interests. Her book, The Land is the Law, looks at the teachings of what are called senior lawmen in Australian society, who are poets, to understand how the land can be something which has feelings, that has interests, which she also links to climate change and the issues of the impact on the environment. So I think that's very exciting, because it's not only democratic and a decolonial process, but it's also adding greatly to our understanding of what is law, and law isn't necessarily purely a matter of human interests.
That is a fascinating example. You both mentioned literature in different ways, and I know that Farid's course in Singapore draws in literary and creative texts into a sociology program. Could you tell us a little bit about practically how there is this possibility of bringing what we see as different forms, the literary form and the academic sociological, into that same educational space?
Thank you. Well, as I was saying, in our education, in the social sciences, we tend to take the science part too seriously, and we've taken out the arts from the arts and social sciences. So the idea is that science is about explanation, science is about truth, and art is about feeling, emotions, beauty. So they're separate. And I try to put across to my students that both so-called scientific and artistic modes of knowing are equally relevant. So to give you an example, when I teach social theory, there's a section on alienation, and I assign some pages from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of Marx. But at the same time, I ask them to read the Metamorphosis of Kafka, because what they fail to understand from Marx's text, they may actually experience by putting themselves in the place of the characters, particularly the character of Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis. They may actually be able to experience the process of alienation, because the poetic method it brings us to knowledge by stirring the imagination, right? What the Muslims call takhil, to stir the imagination. And this is a valid form of arriving at knowledge, as well as reading a philosophical text. So I think what I try to do in my classes is to mix these modes as much as possible, using particularly literature, apart from social science texts, using literature and also using visual arts.
Okay. There have been some interesting examples of how craftspeople have contributed to our understanding of alternative ways of conducting. For instance, many traditional societies are key to health and well-being are various ritual practices, often which involve talismans, or amulets, which were considered as forms of magic, witchcraft by colonizers, and replaced with more technological medicine, one which involves buying drugs and visiting specialists. And but these objects can be very important for a sense of well-being, and particularly support a sense of doing the correct thing. So a number of designers have looked at how we can adapt these objects to contemporary concerns, and there was a Maori jeweler who finished her PhD, and she looked at the impact of the earthquake which had devastated the city of Christchurch, and how people had to rebuild not just their buildings but their sense of confidence. And she adapted a Maori symbol, a taonga, which is their sacred object, of the matariki, the cluster of stars in the sky, which was distributed as acts of solidarity around these victims of the earthquake, which helped them strengthen their sense of continuity despite the fact that their world had collapsed. So I think it's seeing craftspeople and designers as adapting our traditions to contemporary circumstances can provide an important contribution to understanding.
I think we have a question down here, if I could bring the microphone. We'll come back this way. I'd already said to Dr. Hagen, speak, sorry, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. من تشکر میکنم از آقای فرید عطاس و نکات چهارگانه خوبی که اشاره کرد.
I want to thank Mr. Farid Alatas and the 4 points that he's mentioned. I think you understand Farsi.
Not like my understanding of English. عرض کنم که این وقتی که ما یک راهی رو حرکت میکنیم با مشکلات جدیدی که متناسب اون راه هم هست باش مواجه میشیم.
When we're moving within a path, we will face the problems that are also within that path.
ما در ایران حدود 3 دهه یا 4 دهه هست که نسبت به این مسئله فکر میکنیم